Well, welcome to another installment of Ministers Joe and Josh Discuss. We're in Genesis chapter 22 today. Genesis chapter 22, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. He said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there. We will worship, and then we'll come back to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father, and he said, Here I am, my son. He said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God showed him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. He said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you've not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, The Lord will provide. And it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So let's stop there for now, Minister Joe. I think that gives us quite a lot to deal with before we get into the conversation that the angel of the Lord has with Abraham after these events. So probably the best play, I mean, we could start at the beginning. We always say that, right?
Yeah.
Go back to the beginning. But we probably should talk about a little history. So I'll do that, and then you can interact with that as you want, and then we'll go back to the beginning and see if we can deal with what the text actually tells us.
Mm-hmm.
Not a lot of history to cover, but one very important thing. This is not an unusual assumption. Now, I was going to say it's not an unusual request from the gods, but remember, when we're talking about the other gods, not the one true God, the people are mostly speaking for them. But it's pretty common, this child sacrifice in the religions of the ancient Near East. So it is probably not overly surprising to Abraham. Remember, he is still learning who this God is. He's known him for about 23 years, maybe a little bit more now. He's been following him, maybe longer than that. But he knows this God to a degree. But probably in his mind, this God still reflects mostly the characteristics Abraham was raised to believe gods reflect. So he probably would not have been surprised that this God would have asked him to sacrifice his son. That's something that the pagan deities of the ancient Near East asked a lot. And most all the religions that we know of in these regions engaged in child sacrifice. So it's probably not surprising that this did not surprise Abraham. But given God's promises about Isaac, it seems like a strange thing for God to ask. So we still have to deal with how Abraham might have understood this request. And I think the New Testament helps us with that. But we'll get to that. But I want to at least say that child sacrifice is a very common part of the pagan religions of this area. And not just this area. Child sacrifice and human sacrifice generally are part of many religions throughout the earth. So this is one point in which, at least momentarily, the God of Abraham would appear to be very similar to the other gods, at least in his mind. Now, he's going to learn through this process that this God is nothing like the other gods. But the initial request probably was not surprising to Abraham, given his context. So do you have any comments about that, Minister Joe? I just feel like that history is probably important.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important for us to understand that there are other things that were accepted in Abraham's culture too, I mean, we talked about, separate wives is something else there. The, surrogate children, or all these things that we could point out, or say, well, those are mistakes, or those are bad things, or whatever. But the reality comes down to is that Abraham himself is being transformed through this faith walk, this encounter with God. And so there there's probably some elements in the text or around the text that if they were added, they would probably give us more of the emotion or the things that Abram encountered. But they're simply not there. They're left for us to imagine.
Right.
We
Yeah, we don't get much internal discussion about what Abraham dealt with in the wake of this. I remember I heard a pastor once in a church that I was attending preach an entire sermon about why Abraham woke up early the next day. And in his imagination, Abraham woke up early because he couldn't sleep because of the difficulty of this request of God. And so, like any man, is the way this pastor put it, he just got up early and got himself to work. And so he felt the detail of getting up early was meant to indicate to us that Abraham was struggling with it. Of course, that's a very difficult thing to prove. Like Abraham could have gotten up early because he was anxious to obey God. It's hard to imagine that. But anyway, we do like to dance between the lines. And you're right to point out, Minister Joe, that we're not given much of Abraham's internal discussion. Now, the New Testament, funny enough, will reveal a few things about what Abraham might have been thinking that are not in the text. But we'll get to that when we get to the book of Hebrews.
I think also too in that culture that I think it would probably been it's not so uncommon for people to I mean, even in our culture, there's the issue of abortion and the value of life. But I think it would be useless to really point out why we think that sacrifice is so common back then. And probably one of them was to appease the gods, to
yeah, you and I talked about this a little before we started
culture.
recording, but child sacrifice then and today are for the same reason. And you might say, child sacrifice today? That's all abortion is child sacrifice. And it's really for the same reason as infant sacrifice occurred in Israel and against God's will and in the ancient Near East according to their religion. The child is sacrificed to improve the life of the family. That's why they're sacrificed in the ancient world. So you might sacrifice your eldest son so that you wouldn't have to face a famine or a drought, so the rest of your children could survive. And there was some sort of a belief that is carried through the pagan religions of the ancient Near East that the eldest son is the most valuable child to the gods. Now, it's interesting they believe that because Jesus does eventually come. And there's no doubt that the sacrifice of God's firstborn son saves us all. So there might be a sense in which somehow this is in the water.
Yeah.
That they kind of had a sense that this was true long before it was. But the point is, child sacrifice then was meant to improve the future of the family. Now, there are other times children would be sacrificed. Grisly stories that we get, like in the book of Lamentations, for instance, in the New Testament, where during sieges and things, parents would sometimes kill their children for food. And that happened. And I know it's grisly, but it's in the Bible. So the point is, when children are sacrificed, it's always for the good of the future. That's their belief. It's either to preserve the family, to ward off famine, to end a curse, or to feed the family. They were seen as less important. Now, abortion today functions in exactly the same way. These children are seen as obstacles to whatever life we want to have. For the most part, we're not talking about the times in which kids are being sacrificed because you have to choose between the mother's life and the child's life. We're not talking about issues of rape or incest, what people often bring up. But under the normal idea of abortion, the child is going to get away in the way of a parent's education, or personal improvement, or the child is seen to have a defect of some sort that would make them harder to care for. And in most cases, when abortion occurs, it's because there's some sort of an idea that the death of this child will improve the likelihood of future children thriving or the quality of life of the presumed child themselves or the parent. It's the same reason they did infant sacrifice in the ancient world. It was always about the future, sacrificing this child for the good of the family, but however you determined goodness. So we should recognize that infant sacrifice is still alive and well, and that there are still plenty of people in the world being told that it's okay to sacrifice the life of a child for the good of the family or for the good of the future. They're still being told that, and that's the way it was in the ancient Near East. We shouldn't separate ourselves too much from that and think that we've kind of outgrown it, because we haven't. And so Abraham is being told by this God to sacrifice his son. And Abraham is already learning who this God is, and he lives in a culture in which he knows what to refuse a God, what kind of a whirlwind you invite if you do that. So you don't see Abraham spending a lot of time deliberating.
Right. Right.
You know who's not in this story, though, Minister Joe? How do you feel about this? Sarah.
Right. Well, I think just as when the visitors came to ask Abraham if where Sarah is, I think she was left out of this.
I think she was. I really doubt that Abraham would have gotten out of that house that quickly if he had had an honest conversation with Sarah. I don't know. Maybe he told her and she was fine with it, but there's no dialogue between them about this incident anywhere in Genesis.
I can hear her saying with that mother Italian voice, "How's some out of you? What's wrong with you? I carried this baby for how long, and I'm this years old, and you think you're going to take my..." I bet it would have got ugly. Really ugly.
It's surprising Abraham doesn't, Abraham interceded with God about Sodom and Gomorrah, right? He debated with him about that. He's talked to God about a number of things. It's just surprising he doesn't say, "Lord, could I say something?" But he doesn't.
What about that Ishmael guy? What about that? He's one of my kids too, and God tells him that this is your only son.
Because Ishmael's been separated, so there are no other heirs in his household, right? That's the importance of Ishmael leaving prior to this. All of Abraham's eggs in terms of the future of his family are in the Isaac basket. And that's what God asked him to sacrifice. And we think of our children maybe not quite the same way that they did in the past. I mean, it is true that our children carry our name and our personal culture into the future, but that would have been much more significant to Abraham than perhaps it is to us, especially since God's covenant he made with him was for the future and for his future children. I mean, seems like quite a lot of the promises God made were bound up in the life of this child. And now God wants him sacrificed.
Right. Well, he does start the right out there though with after these things, God tested Abraham. Talk about that some.
Yeah. So you lead the way with this.
Well,
I know what I'm interested in, and I'll definitely share it with everybody. I'm interested in the word test, but
sounds a lot like the Job scenario. There's a connection with the are you willing to heed to my promise?
Right.
Are you gonna get in the way of what I'm actually going to do for you? So there's a test. I mean, the refining of our faith. I think that's what we're talking about. Is his faith going? It's the future, even if it looks like it's gonna be the end.
Yeah. Why do you think God would do this to Abraham? Why this test? Like, what is this meant to be? As soon as we see the word testing, we think of at least I assume the same word in the New Testament can be used for tempting. But the difference between testing and tempting is that tempting is trying to incite you to do wrong. Testing is trying to evaluate your capacity to do right. So you test metal by stressing it, but your intent is not to break the metal, but to prove its strength. Now, if you were to tempt metal, you'd just be trying to destroy it. So God does not tempt, the New Testament tells us, in the sense that he's not wanting us to fail. He's not trying to incite us to sin. God never does that. That's pretty much Satan's work and the work of our own flesh. But he does test his people, which is the same word in Greek. Maybe there's a little more nuance in Hebrew, but not that much. So he is testing Abraham. We know he does not intend Abraham to disobey. That's not why he's testing him. But he is trying to do something to him. You mentioned Job. In the case of Job, his tests were meant to prove whether or not he loved God for the blessings or whether he would be loyal to God regardless of whether he had blessings or curses in his life. So his faith was being tested. What do you think is being tested here in Abraham? Why does God want to do this?
Well, I think he's testing it first off. I always want to go back to obedience, whether or not, and Abraham's 100 years old here.
Yeah.
And it's like, you always kind of question, can you hear? Sure you can hear what he's saying? Are you getting it right? And I think a lot of times with our faith itself, if we're really honest, when we get something shocking, our first inclination is to say, am I getting that right?
Yeah. And
so that there's a refining of our hearing, refining of our faith, our discernment that has to come about. And I think this is one of the things, and ultimately obeying, and whether or not we're going to obey.
Yeah. Yeah, and my experience, and I don't know what yours is, Minister Joe, but my experience is the Lord often tests us in areas we failed before, like as a way of strengthening us, maybe helping us to gauge. And this is an area that Abraham struggled with in the past. He has struggled with putting his future in God's hands. It began, even though he left his homeland and came to this land, it began the first time he went to Egypt, and he did not trust God to protect him from Pharaoh. And so he had Sarah lie and say that she was his sister as a way of protecting Abraham, right? Because he didn't want to be killed because Pharaoh found his wife beautiful or something like that. So he took matters into his own hands by lying. He did that twice. He did it with Pharaoh. He did it with Abimelech later on in his life. And then he told us in the Abimelech story, he told Abimelech that he's done it everywhere. So this was one way Abraham failed to put his future entirely in God's hands. He was machinating his own way through the world himself, building layers of protection. And Ishmael is that story too. God told him he was going to have a son, but he took matters into his own hand and tried to produce a son through very human means in a way that was more commonly known. If you're an old man, you want to have a child, find a young woman. That would be the way of the world. And so Abraham tried to bring about this thing his own way. And just before Isaac was born, he also asked God, would you reconsider Ishmael as your heir? So Abraham has, putting his full future into God's hands and trusting God with it is something Abraham to this point has never been fully able to do. And this test absolutely tests that. Because Isaac is his whole future in one body. And will he put that body in God's hands?
And that means that even at the expense of killing something. I mean, we'll talk about it again in the New Testament. It's a little commentary thing that we did earlier. But the test is a very real thing, and I think we experience or should experience that. Faith is a growing experience. So it comes out right at the beginning of the chapter saying this is the test.
Yeah, and I know it feels like we haven't got past the first verse, but in many ways we've already gone through the entire story just by dealing with this question of what's being tested. One of the most common responses when I've taught this story or preached it or been even in a Sunday school class where it's simply been read or used as an illustration for something else, one of the most common things I hear from parents are, I could never do that. And if that's your feeling, you've got it. You've got the story. Exactly. This is something. Now, Abraham lives in a culture where this was not an unexpected request. But given what Isaac represents for him and how many of God's promises are bound up in Isaac, this had to have been surprising just because of that. And what would it mean to put something we love the most completely in God's hands, not being sure of what God would do with it? How many of us can really do that? How many of us would trust God to that extent?
And I think that in some ways we are asked to do that. I mean, as a parent, I think we're asked to do that in some ways, where we have to surrender our ultimate authority to God. My daughter was talking about it in her class, her Bible class. They asked the difference between what's the difference between power and authority, and as a question for dialogue for our class. And we talked a little bit about that, but I said that the context really does make a difference. But we're given a certain amount of authority as parents or as adults over those that have been given authority over.
Yeah.
And so we have to realize that I believe as a Christian, there's a realization that we come under authority, or like the centurion said, Jesus, you just say the word and it's happened.
Yeah.
As the authority. So I think when it comes to our children, we realize that they have to be surrendered. They have to be offered to God. But the question is, or not the question, the reality is we're not trying to kill them before God. God's not asking us, but to surrender their future, their all this to them. Maybe that's part of what God was asking Abraham, saying, realize that you need to be able to relinquish the future of Isaac, your life, and what's going on to my world.
How much sin do people justify in the name of protecting their children or making a better life for their children? Lots of sin is justified in those terms, and that's being taken away from Abraham. Now, I like to use this as a case in point, this story, because one thing I wrestle with people about, and it's more prevalent right now than maybe at any other time in my adult life, though it's been prevalent throughout. And that's when people pluck verses out of the Bible, apply them to themselves without even asking what the context was or whether that's a legitimate promise to claim for yourself. The most common passages that's being done with right now are, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, right, and turn from their sins, then I will forgive their sins and heal their land. People are calling on that's a promise to us. Most people don't even know what the context is or who said it or on what occasion it was said or what God's response to it was, any of those things, but they'll claim it. Or, I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and to give you hope, and a future. Like, people will claim that. We have a tendency as people to assume every positive promise that has ever been made to anyone is made to everyone. And we can claim it at any time. And I often say, you can't assume that what is said in the scripture is said specifically to you, specifically for the time in which you're living. You cannot make that assumption. You have to do some study. This is a passage where people seem to know that. I've never had anyone read this story and then try to find Mariah to kill their child. So they know that this isn't for them. At least they have an instinct it's not for them. And the reason I bring that up is just to remind us that just because it's positive doesn't mean it's for you. And just because it's negative doesn't mean it's not. Now, I'm not saying that you should go out and do this, but people seem to know that there's a context here. And the question is, and I'm asking you kind of, Minister Joe, but I don't expect you to answer it exactly unless you're ready to. How do we know that God is not asking every person who follows him to be prepared to sacrifice their firstborn child in this way?
Well,
this is a biblical exegesis thing. How do we know?
Well, it is a test, and I think that's a good starting point to say that we know that the testing of our faith proves perseverance. That sounds like a James thing,
Yeah.
and I think that ultimately, what I was saying before is I think God is asking us to surrender everything to Him. That's what part of part of
But
part
how
of
do you know you shouldn't take this literally? Take a knife to your child's throat.
because I think I
Because it was literal for Abraham, right? God wasn't metaphorically asking Abraham to just sacrifice his future. He was literally asking him to kill his son, right?
right.
And now it would have been very convenient for Abraham if he could have said, "Oh, you mean that metaphorically."
Right.
But that
Yeah.
wouldn't have worked out.
Yeah. I think for me, it's just like I to automatically I'd say that's against character, and but yet it doesn't help our connection with this passage
Yeah,
to say it's against His character because it's actually God asking him
because
to
it's
do it.
actually God asking.
But
So this is just for help, and we're all struggling around with this just for the sake of making a point, which is Abraham doesn't know God. And God makes a request that normal gods in their day, the pagan false gods that people believed in, would have asked. And so
Mhm.
God is not afraid to present himself as just a run-of-the-mill God. I've done all these promises for you, and now sacrifice that kid to me. That that's would have been what would have been expected by most people, that God would, if he does this amazing stuff for you, that he would expect a sacrifice. In fact, in the ancient Near East, you might even have assumed that that after everything God did, he would give you a child so that you could sacrifice him to him. Like that might even been the whole intent. Now, our God reveals himself to be quite different than those gods when he doesn't actually require the sacrifice.
Mhm.
So that's going to reveal something. But we know that this is not a command for us because of the law. God reveals what
Right.
he wants in the law.
Right.
And in the law of Moses, this is Deuteronomy 18, verse 9.
Yep.
God says to the people through Moses, when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you must not learn to imitate the abhorrent practices of those nations. No one shall be found among you who makes a son or daughter pass through the fire. This is a way of talking about child sacrifice. So God is insistent that they are not to do this. So we know that this particular word to Abraham is not something that every follower of Yahweh from here on out should embody, because the law tells us this is not something God wants.
Right.
And so this is part of the way you interpret. You do the same thing with those positive texts. Why does this text promise what it does? Is it rooted in the law of Sinai? Is it rooted in the character of God? Is it rooted in the promises of the new covenant of Jesus? You have to ask those questions. We know that this was unique to Abraham because God later prohibits this behavior for all time. So we know he's not going to ask us to do this again.
Right.
Because the law now prohibits it. But in Abraham's day, it was something the gods often were thought of as asking. And so God is not only testing Abraham's obedience, which he is, but he is also revealing to Abraham something about the true character of God that he would not have known. So all of that is bound up in this passage, in this sacrifice. Now, interestingly enough, when God eventually asks the Israelites during the Exodus, which is what we just finished reading about, right, in our reading together, when he asked them to sacrifice a lamb to put the blood on the door frames, right?
Mhm.
That lamb is a substitute for their firstborn sons. And he does say the firstborn son belongs to him. And in order to avoid sacrificing him, they're to sacrifice a lamb. And that becomes part of the history of Israel. A sacrifice is done for a firstborn male for the rest of their history. So it's not as though God doesn't make claims to the future. That's what the firstborn son is. He's the heir. Therefore, in this culture, therefore, God has claims on the heir because he has claims on the future. So there's something those pagan religions got right. But what they got wrong is who God is. And God doesn't want these children killed.
Right.
So that, I know that's not really part of this story, Minister Joe, so you probably weren't ready to talk about that exactly. But any excuse I can find to help people learn how we apply the teachings of individual texts to our lives, to me is worth discussing.
Right. Right.
And
Yeah.
this is a good one, because many parents after reading this become fearful that God might ask this of them and that they wouldn't have the ability to do it.
Yeah. It's almost the other extreme. If God were to ask me to do this, I don't love my kid, or I don't, and then the other extreme where I don't love God if I'm not willing to do everything He says.
Yeah.
But the point is so abundantly clear that our kids need to be surrendered to God.
They do need to be surrendered to God. And Israel embodied that by these sacrifices. They embodied it by making their children children of the law. They embodied it by making sure their children left their particular leadership and became leaders in their own right and got married. Like, all of this stuff is actually a sin not to be married in ancient Israel. Like this idea that our children don't belong to us, that they belong to God, and that the life that they live is unto God and not unto their families. That is built into Israel through their sacrificial practices, and it's rooted right here in the story of Abraham.
Yeah, so maybe the real point, maybe I'm letting this out too early, but maybe the real point is not so much sacrifice, but surrender.
I think that's what it becomes. Though, of course, we'd want to be fair to Abraham. In his mind, it was sacrifice.
He was ready for it. He had the fire.
He was ready. His example becomes an example of surrender, but we shouldn't cheapen what he went through. He thought he was going to slit his son's throat.
Yeah, that would have been very ugly.
It's nice to live after Abraham.
Mm-hmm.
We now know that God is asking him to surrender the life of his son. Praise God. But that's not what Abraham thought.
This is the time that I show the picture?
Yeah. You have an old picture of.
So if you've been
it's actually not a bad rendering. The only problem, do you see the only problem in that one?
I can't see it real well right now. You pointed out for me.
Well, if you turn it around, I'm seeing stones underneath Isaac.
Oh, yeah.
It would have probably been mostly wood.
Yeah, right. Yeah, how are we going to light them on fire, huh? There's a little bit there. I wouldn't know that
There's
much.
a little kindling.
Yeah, I think I like the look on his face though.
Yeah, we're going to talk about that, I think, before we're done today, is the impact that this has on Isaac. Because as positive as a scene as it is for Abraham's faith, it really, really seems to be difficult for Isaac.
Yeah, he's not laughing right now.
No,
Sure.
no. You wonder if his relationship with Abraham was ever the same.
I
We
don't
know
think-
that his relationship with God was somewhat different, because, the way God is referred to after the time of the patriarchs is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Jacob has a unique way of referring to God in the book of Genesis. He calls him the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac. You won't see that anywhere, but Jacob says that. And once
There's
you
a
read
good
this
reason
story,
why.
it's not surprising. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
it's surprising. The God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac. Yeah. So, and Isaac is an interesting character. He doesn't get a lot of text in the book of Genesis, and he's at odds with his wife and easily manipulated by his kids. And, there's a lot of things that you wonder how much of it was tied to this early trauma.
You're right.
Yeah, there's a consequence to obedience to God. Most parents would be unwilling to pay. Abraham's willing to pay it, though. So when it says in verse 3, Minister Joe, that Abraham rose early, I told you about the pastor who kind of read in that it's because Abraham couldn't sleep. But obviously the detail's important because it's given to us here. Why do you think it's here? Do you have thoughts about that?
Well, I think it was a long way to walk.
It's a 3-day journey.
He's 100 years old plus.
Yeah, Abraham is in the region of the Negev. At least last we saw him making this covenant with Abimelech, he was in the region of the Negev. And traditionally, Moriah is the mountain range where Jerusalem now sits. That's traditionally where it is. So he's journeying from southern region of Judah to the more northern, almost into what later would be the northern kingdom of Israel, really close to that. So it's a long journey. It said it took him 3 days. Yeah. That's what's interesting to me. That's not a 3-day journey. I don't think that's a 3-day journey. Now, I could be wrong about that if anybody wants to prove me wrong. But as I look at it, I don't think it should have taken 3 days to make that walk. But do you know anything about that, Minister Joe? I probably caught you off guard with that.
Well, the 3 days I wrote down as something that's I think is symbolic.
Yeah, let me, you look at this with me. Now, I don't walk a lot of places. So perhaps this is a 3-day journey. Maybe it is. So this is Beersheba. Last we saw Abraham, he was in this region of Beersheba. And this is the mountain range. This is where Jerusalem is. And this is traditionally the mountain range of Moriah. So this is the journey. What do you think?
What's the elevation? Is it a mountainous?
Yeah, it's hilly.
Really,
It's hilly, but there's a road that leads through here. It's a route right through the hill country, a pretty well-worn road in these days. When Abraham first came into the region, he came in and traveled this whole route top to bottom.
Yeah.
And of course, we know that there's a famous king who rules in Salem, just near Moriah, where Abraham would have gone with Isaac, and that's Melchizedek, right? He's the king of Salem. So anyway, maybe that is a 3-day journey. I guess I'm suggesting maybe Abraham took his time.
Yeah, he was dragging feet. Yeah.
He certainly wasn't huffing it.
Right. Well, he might have been huffing it, but it was not for the reasons.
Well, and he didn't take animals with him. Do you notice that detail? Isaac's like, I mean, they're shepherds. So usually when they go on a trip, they're going to take all the sheep, right? Because they're going to find grazing fields. But Isaac says to Abraham, we don't have anything to sacrifice.
Right.
So they didn't even take the animals. So it's probably a quicker journey than they would have normally been accustomed to.
Right. And then their servants with them. And then, I mean, Abraham says, we will go over there to worship. You guys stay here. So that the purpose, obviously, I don't think he discussed it with Isaac.
No, it's clear that Isaac doesn't really know what he's in for, right?
Yeah, never even crossed his mind. And then,
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to read this story, especially when it says the 3rd day, and not kind of correlate with the story of Jesus. What's very interesting to me, because God actually does sacrifice his only begotten son. And that's probably a bad way to translate that word. I think when we first encountered that word in the New Testament, the assumption was it was built from 2 words, first, and then the word ganao for birth. So we thought of firstborn, only begotten. But we now know that the compound word is made up of the root for only and the root meaning unique. So it's literally his unique son. That's probably better. But in any case, God was going to sacrifice his own son. When Jesus dies, it's 3 days before he's resurrected from the dead. He's resurrected on the 3rd day. Jesus carries his own cross. Isaac carries the wood for his own sacrifice. Like, there's so many parallels. The most shocking thing is that the New Testament never draws any of those parallels. And it's interesting. The early fathers noticed the correlation between this and the cross immediately, but it's not in the New Testament. And I wonder if we're not supposed to draw those parallels, or if it was just so obvious that they didn't feel the need to mention it. But when I see this 3-day journey, it just seems like it's so foreshadowing what happens with Jesus,
Yeah, there's definitely that foreshadowing the will, but the difference is the will of the Father enacted on the Son, whereas maybe the uncomfortableness would have been that Jesus was willing to go to the cross.
Right. Maybe that's true. Maybe that's why. You got a good point there. Maybe there just aren't enough comparisons. Yeah.
Where the analogy
and this
breaks
3-day
down.
journey to Moriah is almost it mirrors what happens in the Exodus, right? Where Moses actually says that God wants Pharaoh to release the people for a 3-day journey so he can worship him in the wilderness. And that is a direct relationship, right, to what's happening here. Right. Abraham says to Isaac, we're going to go for a 3-day journey and worship God. Yeah. So there's definitely allusions to the Exodus anyway.
Right. And then the elements there too, the firewood and you know,
Yeah,
and
what do you think? He says Abraham, who carries the fire?
Abraham does.
Yeah, what does that mean? Carries the fire. You think he had a Zippo?
Yeah, it was the Abraham equivalent of Zippo. Yeah,
The
you probably
torch?
never heard the movie Quest for Fire. Yeah, you heard of that?
No,
It's about.
I've heard of chariots of fire.
I probably shouldn't comment to it. But it's about cavemen and they learn what fire is and they're trying to
Oh,
preserve it.
oh, I probably saw All I Needed in the Jungle Book. I saw a great song about
That's right. King of the
man's
Swing,
red flower.
King Louis. Yeah, that's a better reference right there. It's a lot better. Yeah, the whole thing of carrying that, keeping the fire alive. Uh,
Do you think he took it? I mean, it's just interesting. He says he carried the fire. Um, from where? I mean, I'm sure they knew how to start fires, right? It's just an interesting phrase to me because I would have thought he could have started the fire up on Mount Moriah, but but is he taking it from their campsite? Are they suggesting he carried this fire all the way from his home camp? Like, this is a little aspect of history I'm not sure of. I once saw a movie that was supposed to be based on history where they would keep coals and embers in kind of a fire pot and they would carry it with them. And if you remember Abraham's covenant with God in Genesis 15, God appears to him as a smoking pot.
Yeah.
Was he carrying something like that? Is it meant to be an allusion back to that covenant where God promises him a son in chapter 15? It's just an interesting phrase I wanted to sit down on. I mean, do you know much about how people carry fire? Do you think it could have been a fire pot, or do you think this just means he was carrying a torch?
It could be that he was carrying like a fire pot. I think that's probably more of the practical side. But I think it speaks more to the ability to control the sacrifice. Because a lot of people would say you have the fire with you. In other words, that you have matches in your pocket,
Yeah,
or
that's
you
why I
have
said
the
the Zippo.
ability. Yeah, the ability to make fire. It is more than likely he had the flint knife, and all you would have needed was something to make a spark.
Right.
So essentially, he
Now,
had
you
control.
and I, Minister Joe, I think we shared this. I think we talked about this. We have a favorite way to start a campfire.
Oh yeah,
What do you like to take with you?
the torch,
Oh yeah, propane, man. Well, you
propane
might
torch.
use MAP gas. I like a propane torch.
Well, math gas burns hotter, but depends on what you got. How you have is what really matters.
I think of people who use MAP gas as professionals.
Oh, there you
Like, if you've got MAP gas, I think of you as a plumber. Propane's
go.
for the rest of us.
If you got acetylene, what are you then?
Oh
You're a
man, you're out
welder.
of my league. You're out of
You're
my
a welder.
league if you've got acetylene. You've
So
got all kinds of stuff I don't have. But yeah, when we think about carrying the fire, um, you're right. Do you think that this is, I mean, it reminds me, now that you've said it, of Elijah going to the mountain to have his little showdown with the prophets of Baal, where God provides the fire. Now, Abraham is sure that God will provide the sacrifice. But do you think him carrying the fire is a lack of faith?
no, I see it as being prepared. Being prepared. Probably Isaac is saying maybe the story is saying to Isaac, from Isaac's point of view, you have control over the fire. You have control over the actual burning of the sacrifice. So maybe what's being revealed to us is that God does give us some of the things that gives us the things that we need.
Yeah.
For ministry, or what we need for faith. We have to act on it.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, you wouldn't read this as a negative that he's carrying the fire, just a sense of preparation.
Yeah.
Though, as the story unfolds and we get to know God more and more, we know that God is not only able to provide the sacrifice, but the fire as well. Right? Abraham could have gone up there with nothing, but he didn't know that.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that in some of it's too, probably on the humanist side, the humanity side, is that these are the logical things that we need. Like from the church, if you or go to a job, or you go to a class, you have a pencil. You know, those are some basic things that we thought, or we think we need. When God, you know, like Elijah, God could have just made the fire come. This is part of how we participate in God. Part of our obedience is to prepare.
Yep. The only
Right.
thing Abraham did not prepare in advance was the sacrifice.
Right.
Right. He did not tell Isaac what they were doing. So he
Right.
did not prepare the sacrifice, but he did bring who he believed the sacrifice would be with him, but he did not prepare him. He did prepare the fire.
I really think that if he had told Isaac, I don't think Isaac would have won.
Yeah. Well, you wonder, in this world, would Isaac have had the fortitude to refuse his father?
I think either way he would have, you know, that's what I'm saying. It's difficult to exactly know, but I can't imagine a guy 100 years old wrestling down a
But we don't have to guess whether Isaac knew he was the sacrifice, right? Because the text makes that abundantly clear. When Isaac asks where the lamb is,
right.
it reveals to us that Abraham did not tell him.
Yeah.
And Abraham doesn't answer him honestly. Well, he does. I mean, it's kind of honesty of a sort. God will provide the lamb. Turns out to be literally true, but that's not what Abraham thought was going to happen. It's kind of like he's answering without answering. You know, he's telling him God will provide. And of course, God is the one who gave Isaac to Abraham. So in a way that's true. But it reminds me a little of Obi-Wan Kenobi in Star Wars. You know, what I told you was true from a certain point of view.
Right. Or it's like the father passing the gas station. Oh, we know where we're going. We'll be okay. We're not lost.
Yeah, we're not lost. So then Abraham, you mentioned this already. We'll just kind of walking through the text. Abraham leaves his servants behind and he proceeds with Isaac alone. Is it, you know, for a story that's so brief and gives us so few of the details we'd like to know, like what did Sarah think? What did they talk about on the way? Like all the things it doesn't say, we have to zone in on what it does say. Why does it want us to know that Abraham left his servants behind?
I don't think he wanted them to see it.
Do you think they would have objected to the death of the heir?
Yeah, I think they would have. I don't know.
I think this would have been something hard to do in front of people.
Yeah.
Do you think?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. Yeah, he didn't want them to see it.
Yeah, I don't, if you're going to do something this radical and with this much consequence, it's not surprising he would want to be alone.
Yeah, I can't even imagine.
It also might mean, do you think he told the servants? Do you think they knew?
No.
You don't think so? I wonder if they suspected. Isaac's carrying wood, Abraham's carrying fire. There's no sacrifice, and they're going up to a mountain where they're unlikely to find any animals. I wonder, and they grew up in the ancient Near East. They know of the Sumerians. They know of the Canaanite tribes, all of which sacrificed their firstborn children to their gods. I think these servants knew what was going on myself.
It's kind of hard to imagine that they didn't.
Yeah.
I'm saying because like for all those points you just made, but
yeah,
you got to connect the dots sometime.
Yeah, I think some of them. If Eliezer's there, Eliezer's a smart guy. I think he knew what was up. It must have been a tough, and there's a detail nobody talks about very much, and it's that Isaac and Abraham don't come down the mountain together at the end. The text says Abraham descended alone. And I've often wondered, what did those servants think when they saw him coming by himself? You know?
What did the old man do? What did the old man do?
Yeah, and more interesting, what in the world was Isaac doing alone on that mountain? I hope God gave him a nice pep talk after that.
Yeah,
but we don't know that either. Like that's just not told to us. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So Abraham's carrying the fire. Again, I think maybe a fire pot, but maybe a torch. I don't know. I like the fire pot idea. I think it ties us back to to 15. Isaac said to his father, his father Abraham, "Father," he said, "Here I am, my son." He said, "The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So the two of them walked on together. I still think Isaac asked that question out of fear. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he's just a curious kid, but I don't know.
Definitely intuitive. He knows what's needed for the sacrifice.
He's seen sacrifice. He must have.
Yeah, he knows what's needed, and there's something missing.
Yeah, you know how sometimes you ask a question because you're just a little worried? And who knows? I mean, they lived among the Philistine people, maybe. It all depends on how you read it. At least Abimelech's people. And these cultures were known for sacrificing their firstborn son. I don't know. You know, has he had much interaction with these people? Did anybody ever say to him, "How did you get off? You're the firstborn son, right? You're supposed to be dead." Like, you wonder if there was any of that stuff. And I know it's not in the text, but Isaac asked this question, and Abraham is forced to address this issue before he wants to. And Abraham's got a creative answer, which makes me think he thought about it. What am I going to do if he asks? Because Abraham was ready with this response.
Yeah.
There's just a lot of layers to this story.
Yeah. He seems like he's confident about what he says, though. It's not as well. I mean, we're reading the text, but you kind of wonder how he said it. I'll provide the sacrifice. He'll provide the sacrifice.
Now, this is where the book of Hebrews, maybe it's worth at this point going to what the writer of Hebrews believed was in Abraham's mind. Do you mind doing that?
Yeah, sure.
Now I know that that's not my normal process because I like the text to speak for itself, but I think the writer of Hebrews steps into a place we're not going to find any answers in the text. If it's okay with you,
yeah,
we'll go there. So let me see here. Sorry, it's a few steps now, but I'm getting there. So this is Hebrews 11. This is verse 17. The actual story of Abraham starts in verse 8, but we'll look at verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when put to the test, offered up Isaac. He who had received the promises was ready to offer up his only son, of whom he had been told, "It's through Isaac that descendants shall be named for you." Hebrews helps us to ask a question that we could see in Genesis easy enough, but maybe we wouldn't see it so clearly without Hebrews. God's asking Abraham to sacrifice his son was a direct contradiction to the promises God had made. So verse 19, he considered the fact that God is able even to raise someone from the dead. And figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. By faith, Isaac invoked blessings for the future on Jacob and Esau. By faith, Jacob. So we get into all that. But the writer of Hebrews suggests that Abraham considered the fact that God might actually have to raise Isaac from the dead in order to be true to his word. So the writer of Hebrews doesn't say Abraham assumed God would provide the ram, and so he never thought he would have to sacrifice Isaac. That's not where the writer of Hebrews goes. The writer of Hebrews assumes that Abraham really believed he would slit his son's throat,
right,
and that God would have to do something afterwards.
Miraculous. Yeah.
So it's interesting where Hebrews believes Abraham's faith was headed.
Yeah.
Because you might argue Abraham had a sense that God was going to provide the lamb, and so he wouldn't have to sacrifice Isaac. But the writer of Hebrews pushes from that. No. Abraham believes God could raise the dead. Now, how does the writer of Hebrews know that? Well, he's getting that from a long traditional oral tradition of the Jewish people, and maybe guided even by the Holy Spirit to get it right, because that's not a detail we could have picked up, but at least not without help. But one thing is clear enough. The writer of Hebrews is insistent. Abraham had every intention of carrying out God's command. And I don't think that as Christians we can read the story in another way.
At any cost, being obedient and personal loss. That's the thing, the personal loss. But I think it also we were talking earlier about how that reflects the parallel with Jesus, and realizing that, because when we talk about Jesus, we talk about him being the uh, actual sacrifice, and we know that Abraham,
Yeah.
that he would not atone for the world's sins. That's just not the
Right.
was here. The real teaching point for Abraham, or testing point, is I don't know that anybody else is arguing anything. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But I think the Hebrew writer is trying. The writer of Hebrew is trying to say that his emphasis is faith in that chapter. That by faith, when he was tested, so the what he seems to be aiming at is that his faith was strong enough, even if he did kill him, for a greater miracle. I think maybe you've said that already, but it's
Yeah.
really it's pretty profound, because he's saying even if he did kill him, I can't imagine the emotional baggage of actually seeing my own son's bloodshed by my own hand.
Yeah. Yeah. And God reveals something to Abraham, like I've been saying. He reveals to him that that's not the kind of request he would make, though Abraham lived in a world where most people believe those are exactly the kinds of requests the gods would make. So God puts Abraham to the test to demonstrate who he is, as much as to test who Abraham is.
Right.
But the fact that this was Abraham's reality, that he thought, at least everybody in his time thought, asked these things. And many people in Abraham's time and afterward literally did this to their children, believing it's what the gods wanted. Abraham went in there fully believing he was going to have to do this. And then he imagined that if God was going to be truthful to his word, he would then have to do a miracle. That's what Hebrews suggests. And it's very a logical deduction. But the question I often ask myself is, would it make it any easier for me if I knew that God would raise my child from the dead? And I think the answer is no. That's what you're saying, right?
You'd have to face him again.
Yeah. Like it's amazing that Abraham would be willing to do it, but the idea that God will raise him from the dead wouldn't make it any easier for me.
That's right.
Because you still would have to do it. So I don't know. The faith of Abraham is quite intense. You really have to trust. You would have to trust so unbelievably a person who would ask you to do something like this. And Abraham clearly has come to trust God in ways that are not at all like the ways he trusted God at the beginning. And it's no wonder that the book of James uses this as an example of how Abraham's faith put on feet, how it became flesh, how he proved what he claimed to believe in this instance. It's no wonder he says that. This would be remarkable. And I want to insist, the reason God uses this as the test, in my view, is because this is what the culture expected. And in a different culture, maybe a different test. But in this culture, sacrificing one's child, firstborn child, to the gods was often expected. So God, this is what the gods do? Well, then do it for me.
Right.
And Abraham is willing, and God says, once he sees he's willing, he says, that's not something I ask.
That's not me.
But it is something God will do to his own son. So there's so much bound up in this story. But I want to insist, God will not ask this of us today because it's not who he is. But the reason he asked it of Abraham is to prove who he is. Because the gods of Abraham's day were presented in this way, as deeply selfish, of hungry for human life, of wanting to consume humans for their own sustenance. That's how the gods are presented. And so when God first comes to Abraham, he has to work through those assumptions. And so oftentimes, and we have to be careful with this ourselves, Minister Joe, oftentimes God will present himself to his people in the way they expect to see him. But just because God presents himself to us in that way doesn't mean that's how he wants to be seen. It may mean it's the only way he can be seen at first. So he comes to Abraham as a God who wants a child sacrificed. And that's how all the gods came to the pagan world. But then he proves that's not who he really is. I've often said this. Some of us have experienced God through music, right? Or through a type of preaching that maybe isn't exactly godly, or through an experience that probably wasn't the best of experiences. God comes to us and reveals himself to us as we are able to see him. But we should not justify that occasion. So, for instance, God does not ideally communicate with us through music. That's a very pagan thing. The pagans use music as a way to connect with the gods. The pagans use sex as a way to connect with the gods. The pagans use feasts as a way, they indulge their flesh as a way to connect with the gods. That's been true through pagan stuff all the time. So it's not surprising when you're infused with this stuff that you might first encounter God through a song.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that that's how God wanted you to encounter him. It just means it was the only time you were willing to encounter him. That's the same principle I think we're getting from Abraham. God has to present himself to Abraham in a cultural way. But then as Abraham walks up to Mount Moriah with God, God proves that he is not like those other gods. That in fact, those other gods are misrepresentations. God would not ask him to kill his child. But he lived in a world where he thought God would, and so God did. Ideally for us, God would not come to us through music. That's not how he comes to his people. But maybe that's the only way we can hear him at first. So my point is that we should not diminish the way in which God has to, if he wants to encounter us, deal with our presuppositions. And that's what's happening on this mountain. God is confronting Abraham based on a presupposition that the firstborn son should be sacrificed. It's the culture that dictates the terms. But God reveals that he's not that God. And he'll do that for us too. He'll break our cultural expectations, but sometimes not at first.
Right. Yeah, because we probably won't respond positively or the right way.
Right.
Well,
so God comes to Abraham predictably. All right, Abraham, I gave you a kid. Now it's time to kill him. Right? Isn't that what your gods do? And Abraham says, okay. And he has to live like God is a pagan God for 3 days. And then thankfully, praise God, on Mount Moriah, he finds out that that's not the God he serves.
right.
But God had to work that out of him. And talk about the torture. Now, I'm saying all this because I believe if Abraham never believed that God's wanted your firstborn child sacrificed, God might not have had to test him in this.
Right.
It's a test of his theology, not just of his faith.
Right.
And once we get to the law of Moses, God prohibits this forever. So it's clearly not who God is.
Right.
He's not asking for your firstborn. He's not Rumpelstiltskin. But Rumpelstiltskin is like every pagan religion story. Like these creatures want your firstborn child. I don't know why.
So to summarize it, the testing that we experience today, James talks about the trials and those kinds of things. Testing today, obviously if it's in the law, we're not going to do that, but we're still trying to figure out and understand some of these things that are in the law that we struggle with. So there is a reality that we are tested.
Oh yeah, we're tested like Abraham is. I'm talking about the type of testing. You and I will often be tested based on presuppositions. So like, let's say if you believe when God appears to you, whenever he does, he's going to look like a unicorn. Then he could appear to you every day and you would never see him because you're looking for a unicorn. Right?
Right.
But if one day he decides, all right, let's just get through this, and he appears to you as a unicorn, then you know it's God, and then he takes it off and says, why did you want to see a unicorn? You're like, but you appeared as a unicorn. Well, because I appeared to you 10 times, you didn't see me. You know, the thing is, our presuppositions often dictate what we can see. And it's not, I don't think, an idle thing to observe that God appeared to Abraham in this case with a command that was consistent with the pagan gods in the world in which Abraham lived. And you and I have to be very careful. And this is what the problem for the Pharisees with Jesus is, that God appeared to them in the person of Jesus in a way they didn't expect, and because of that, they couldn't see him. And the more that you and I have these pagan ideas, the harder it will be for us to see God when he's right in front of us. And so God had to work through Abraham's preconceptions. So I am suggesting, maybe I've said this enough, but I feel like I'm not getting through. Not to you, Minister Joe. God had to ask Abraham to sacrifice his son because of what Abraham believed about gods. And you may have to go through some things that you wouldn't normally have to go through if you could get your thinking straight about God.
Yeah, that's certainly true in my life. I've had to learn things several times as well. You know, and it's that carpenter's adage, you know, measure twice, cut once. We got to get the measurement right.
Yep, my father said the same thing. And you know, if you've ever done it, how many times, Minister Joe, have you cut something and it's a half inch? Or for me, if it's going to be wrong, it's going to be an inch wrong.
An inch wrong.
Because it's supposed to be 23 3/4, and I cut it at 22 3/4. That's going to happen to me.
Yeah, I've come up with a comment like this. I don't care if I get it wrong the first time. Never be too short.
Yeah, it's better to be too long than too short. I learned that too.
Yeah.
But it's just as irritating to be either one. You know the old saying that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That's what I was getting at with the unicorn thing. If you already know what God's supposed to look like, then he has no choice but to appear to you in the form you think he's supposed to look like, even if it's the wrong form, because you won't see him if he doesn't appear to you in the way you expect. And so God does that. He blows apart Abraham's whole conception and the whole Middle Eastern conception of what God wants and how to get his favor by asking Abraham to sacrifice his son. This is not just a confrontation between Abraham's faith and his lack of faith. It's not just a confrontation between Abraham's perspective and God's perspective. On Mount Moriah, God declares once and for all the falseness of all the gods of the Middle East. And he does it right in the middle. I am the one true God, and I don't want you to sacrifice your children. Right. But in order to have that sermon, he needed to expose that assumption in Abraham. And so Abraham gets to experience this terrible moment, which he has to conceive and plan and prepare to sacrifice his own son. And it's only necessary because of a misconception about God that existed in his culture and needed to be confronted. And I think the people of Israel have long recognized that in Abraham, God tested the world. Just like in Jesus, he died for the world. You know, Abraham, and there are a lot of false beliefs about God that still need to be exposed. And the people of God are tested to expose their bad beliefs. And I guess that's in the end what I'm driving at, that Abraham's test was not just a test of his faith, but a test of his bad beliefs.
Right. Expose them and bring them to the top.
That's right. And God can't expose them until you've had your parents do this. Have you ever had your parents do this to you, Minister Joe? Do you want something to cry about? You're crying? You want something to cry about?
Oh,
you know, I'll just give you what you want, and then we'll talk about it. And in some ways, Abraham's getting up early and not questioning reveals to me that he expected this. And that might be the reason for the type of test. So if God wanted to tell his people that he doesn't come to them in music, what would be the best way to do that? Maybe take the music away and see if they lose God with it? That's happened to us. Or maybe we think God can only manifest himself in a sufficiently large crowd. Maybe we think it's not 2 or 3, God best manifests himself in 5,000, 10,000, 50,000. The bigger the crowd, the better we know God's there. Maybe that's what we think. What would be the best way to test that? It seems to me that most of God's tests come in the form of trying to evacuate us from our bad ideas. I mean, Jesus, I think, said that 2 or 3 would be sufficient. Seems to me a great many Christians disagree with him. 2 or 3 don't give enough money anyway.
They have to be the very right ones, right?
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to say that this test is deeply rooted in cultural assumptions about gods.
Definitely.
And our test will be too. Most of the time when God tests you and when he tests me, it will be to evacuate our bad ideas and to test our faith. Because when someone tells you what you believe is wrong, it takes a lot of faith to trust that person. So God doesn't begin by telling Abraham he's wrong. He actually begins by allowing him to believe he's right. And then only tells him that he's wrong at the last minute. It's a very interesting teaching technique, don't you think?
Yeah.
And it ends up being, what we find out later is that maybe all these ancient Near Eastern peoples have this idea because it's in the water. God actually was going to sacrifice his only begotten son for the world. He did it before the foundations of the earth. So somehow these early people may be closer to the original creation than any of us. They still had a sense of it. They just didn't understand it. And so a lot of false religions are that way. All trying to do all the right things in all the wrong ways. And maybe this was part of, what Paul says, that the people are without excuse because the heavens declare the glory of God. Maybe somehow they knew. Maybe even the abortion thing that goes on in our culture somehow knows that sometimes it's okay to sacrifice a child for the future. And like the pagan religions, we don't realize that what we're thinking about is Jesus. And God doesn't want us sacrificing our children because he sacrificed his son once for all. There's no need to sacrifice our children. But we don't have the truth, so we keep going down the same bad paths. I think maybe that's too deep for late on a Tuesday afternoon, Minister Joe, but
well, definitely gave them something to chew on. All right.
Well, we're getting kind of late, so we can't probably go verse by verse through this, but I want to make sure that we pick up everything you wanted to say. We got into James a little bit. James says that this event justifies the faith God had in Abraham's faith in chapter 15, that somehow that faith comes to fruit in chapter 22. And the book of James in the New Testament seems to suggest that if Abraham was not willing to do this, then the faith that he seemed to be showing in 15 would not have been genuine. So there's a way in which this must be married together. So obviously, that's a bold claim and one that we should remember. Yeah. But I'll let you point out the last thing you'd like to point out. But one thing I want to point out is just this crazy realization. This is verse 15. The part we didn't read. The angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven, but in Hebrew, heaven is always dual, so the heavens, and said, by myself I've sworn, says the Lord, because you've done this and not withheld your son, your only son, I will indeed bless you. It's almost as though God is saying through the angel of the Lord that now that he's done this, everything God said will come true, which is just interesting. I'll make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the heavens and as the sand that's on the seashore, and your offspring shall possess the gate of their enemies. And the gates are where decisions are made, so that might be important there. Remember, Lot was at the gate. And by your offspring shall all the nations of the earth gain blessing for themselves, because you have obeyed my voice. Verse 19, so Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. No comment of Isaac. That's just one insight. I think you can't talk about this story without observing that Isaac seems to be left on Moriah alone, at least narratively. So I don't want to miss any. I'm sorry I've dominated this conversation more than I had wanted to. But what do you want to say, Minister Joe? What would you not want to be missed?
Well, it's definitely that I mean, it's very apparent to me that even when we are doing what we think God wants us to do, that there can be some strain that happens in relationships. Jesus even went as far as to say that if you want to follow me, you must hate your brother and sister, your mother and father.
Even your own children, it says.
Yeah, talking about how difficult it really can be when God has called you to follow if others are resistant. And I can't help but think that because of this situation between Isaac and Abraham, that there was a rift that was developed, uh, that Isaac probably was not the same after this. I don't think Abraham was the same after it. But it's the physical humanity of it that I think really is the impact in my mind. But we see that in a lot of ways Isaac kind of gets to he doesn't seem to have the same faith that Abraham talks about. But you talked about earlier, brought out how it's the fear of Isaac.
That's what Jacob calls God, the fear of Isaac. Yeah.
And
Jacob, for those who don't know the story real well, Jacob is, of course, Isaac's son.
Right. And Jacob even at one point calls God the God of my father.
Right, the God of my father, yeah.
And which shows that there's some distance there as well, because there were strained relationships that followed too. So you see this idea of familial dysfunction, of brokenness, and yet God still works and uses these men. I think some people in our culture have called it the wound, the ministry of the wound, the wounded healer, or these are all comments that people talk about.
Yeah.
And how oftentimes the people try to explore that. And so I think it's important enough for us to realize that there are some things that are quite traumatic.
Yeah.
My daughter made the mention of but she said this is the third school in 2 years, 3 years, so it's like she's, and your family has experienced something like that as well.
Yeah.
And it's the little bit of that trauma because of being involved in ministry or being involved in following God's will. There are going to be some things that are difficult for us to navigate through and to overcome. And yet, I think in relationship to God, we have to realize the importance of following Him and obeying Him in the light of eternity. I keep saying that I had some conversations with some older people who said that they're only going to live for so long. Why are we live? Why am I still living? Kind of thing. I keep telling them that there's a greater there's importance for them. They have some type of impact that's needs to be done on this earth, because eternity is further and it's longer and it's compared to this life. So there is this in this life because of corruption, because of the dysfunction. There's going to be strain, and yet I feel like God can still use those things for greater purposes than we realize. So I think we would be amiss if we didn't talk about.
Yeah, because what you're talking about is that there's a future for Isaac, and even though this leaves scars on him, he becomes an important person in the whole story of salvation. And even though he carries scars and there are problems in his own family and even with his own children, he still carries forth the message of God into the future. And we should remember that. We should remember that God uses broken vessels. And this experience definitely has its effect on Isaac.
Yeah, I'm sure he didn't recognize the parallels or the commonality he shared with Christ of being the only son.
Well, it's not in the text, so we could never preach on it. We could never teach on it. But he was left alone on that mountain. And at least narratively, I like to imagine that Jesus commiserated with him before he sent him down. I hope so. If not then certainly at the resurrection of the dead. Isaac would be one that I would gladly step to the back of the line. He certainly deserves a conversation before me, right?
Yeah, I mean, so as a father, I see it a little different. As a son, I see the story. I know what it's like to grow up in a single parent home. Family dysfunctions aren't just for single parent homes. It can be any family
Sure,
dysfunction.
sure.
And so I think that it helps us to understand the humanity,
Yeah,
or the psychology that happens here, or we can really sympathize or
yeah.
we attempt to understand.
And the story reminds us again, all of us who are parents, that following God becomes harder when you have children, because anything that you love with all your heart can step between you and God. And certainly that Isaac ran the risk of that because they had waited their whole lives for Isaac. And God definitely begins Isaac's journey by declaring to Abraham that he could not love Isaac more than God. And in terms of who he was most loyal to. And many parents today, you and I talked about this before we started recording, have absolutely put their children before God as idols. They've made decisions that in their view are best for their children, even if it's against what God has asked of us. And many of us run that risk. And the story of Abraham reminds us that God has to be served first and only. Has to be. He won't play second fiddle.
Right.
Even to our children.
And it's keeping that perspective that makes all the difference.
Yeah. And there's a price to be paid. There's a price to be paid for putting God first.
Right.
And those who are truly faithful must pay it. And Abraham's an example of that. What an impossible situation.
Yeah. Right.
But he comes through it and becomes the kind of exemplar of faith from this point forward. And those of us who follow Jesus, Paul says in Romans 9, enter into the faith of Abraham. We become children of Abraham by faith in Jesus. And Abraham's one of the few in the Bible who is called a friend of God. So, Abraham's relationship with God is remarkable, but we should not think that it didn't come at great cost. And it comes at great cost to him. For those of us who are parents, we should take great courage that God is going to care for our children in the way he cares for all of his creatures. But we cannot put them between us and God. We can't do that. Thankfully, he'll never ask us to kill them.
Right.
We see that in the law. It's not in his character. Abraham was tested in that way because of the culture he lived in. But still, the message, like you said at the beginning, of surrender is still strongly there. We have to release all that God gives us. Our children are not excuses for disobedience. And if they ever become that, then they'll be idols. And no child should be worshipped. It's not good for the child. No human can handle worship.
Right.
Parents who worship their children do not do them long-term good, because no human can handle being worshipped. It's too much responsibility. As much as we want it, it's not good for us. Only one can handle worship, only God. And we do a disservice to all others that we worship. You shouldn't worship your spouse. I say that all the time in marital counseling. Your spouse is not responsible to make you happy. Your spouse is not responsible to complete you. Your spouse is not responsible to keep you healthy, wealthy, or wise. That's God. You can't make your spouse God. They will disappoint you.
Right.
You realize that sometimes they will not make you happy, and sometimes they will not anticipate your needs, and sometimes they will not leave you with feelings of contentment that keep you joyous all the time. That's no human can do that. As long as you make humans gods, they will disappoint you and you'll be in conflict with them. God has to be God. That goes for your spouse, it goes for your children.
Right. Right. No other gods.
No other gods. That means you need to let them down. Sometimes you have to let your kids down. Sometimes you have to let your spouse down. The only one you should never let down is God. And if your life is ordered that way, it will in the long run be a blessing to everyone in your life. But in the short run, they will make you pay for not worshiping them like all humans do. But in the end, it's better not to worship them. They can't handle it even if they want it.
Right. I agree.
Because when you get the adoration, you also get the blame. Don't make your kids responsible for your spiritual health. Right, Mr. Joe?
That's right.
It's not up to your kids whether you go to church. If you're not going to church, it's not their fault. It's yours.
Come on down.
That's right. That's right. Best gift a child can give to their parents is to love God more than them. Best gift a parent can give to their child is to love God more than them. Best gift a husband can give to his wife is to love God more than her. The best gift a wife can give to her husband is to love God more than him. If we could get this right, we'd see why it's true. As long as God is God, everything else orders itself correctly. All of our failures and our sins and our sufferings are for living a disordered life, a life in which the priorities are out of order. Jesus comes to show us God is first, and then showing loyalty to our neighbors is next, right? And everything else will fall in place.
How true.
Yeah. But, nobody in the world seems to know it's true because we won't try it. Don't knock it till you tried it. Well, thanks, Minister Joe. Any final words?
I just think that we have to, when we read the scriptures, we need to embrace the truths that are here. I mean, I think you have to think more deeply without really looking about his environment like you brought out so wonderfully. That we need to understand that the distinction that God is making there between the gods of the known world, the God of Abraham. And so in some ways I want to remind us that we're tested, that our faith, our actions, our attitudes, all these things are tested to see how we're going to react.
Yeah.
And who's going to be our Lord. And so I would encourage you not to allow your circumstances to dictate how you react. Your things that you think you need to do, but to evaluate those things.
Yeah.
Work it through and ask God and trust Him with the future. We want to control as much as we can.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. We like to bring the fire to the mountain. That's for sure.
Right. Bring it on. Bring the fire. Fires are hard to put out. They didn't bring any water, did they?
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe Abraham didn't know how out of hand things can get.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's also the last comment I would make is that it's significant that God asked him to go up to a mountain as well, because in the ancient world, it was often believed that the gods lived on the mountains and that it was on the mountains where you could get closest to God. And so God basically comes to Abraham as a stereotypical Middle Eastern God, exactly in the guise Abraham would have expected. I want you to sacrifice your son. I want you to come up onto a high place. Well, that's what all the pagan gods wanted. So God comes to Abraham as Abraham expected to see him, and then on the mountain reveals to him that he is nothing like Abraham expected to see. What's most important is what he reveals on the mountain. And it'll be true for us as well. Sometimes I think, we hear these stories of people who are having visions, like sometimes Muslim people who are having visions of Jesus calling them, and it leads them to Christ. And then when they're asked, what did he look like? Well, he looks like the picture of Jesus that they were shown. And you would say, well, why is that? I mean, Jesus probably didn't look like that. But the thing is, if Jesus came to most modern Americans without a beard, they wouldn't believe it was Jesus because they saw the picture.
Mm-hmm.
No, like when you have this in your imagination, what somebody has to look like, they're not really allowed to look any differently, or else you wouldn't know it was them.
Right.
So in some ways, God does come to us as we expect him to appear at first, but then he will reveal to us who he really is. It's only the false gods who stay the way we want them to look. But the real God will show you how you're wrong. And that's what he does on Mount Moriah. And that's what he does for each of us. I've been shocked, Minister Joe, during this time of shutdown, how much I've been able to fellowship with the Lord without any of the things I normally relied on. He's really showed me that what I thought I needed, I didn't. He showed me that worship is about something different. I thought worship was about encountering God. In fact, I was pretty sure I couldn't encounter him without worship. He's taught me something entirely different during this lockdown. Apparently, I don't need worship to encounter him, but I do need worship. And I'm learning more why he commands it. But it wasn't for what I thought it was for. That's what tests do. They expose our false beliefs. Sometimes we won't even let God be different than we expect him to be. So he's shown me that that encountering God is different than worshiping him. And I would never have separated the two till this shutdown. I hope I'm learning well.
Sounds like it to me.
Yeah. It's strange though.
Thinking outside the box.
Well,
Right?
yeah. When I built the box, I expected God to find God in it, right? And sometimes he appears to you in the box you built, makes you think the box is pretty good, but maybe he's just appearing there because it's the only box you got.
He's telling you to get out of the box.
Yeah.
Get out of the box.
But Abraham learned that the God he was serving was entirely different than what he had been told. He'd been learning that slowly through his whole life, but on that mountain, he learned something radical.
Yeah. Wasn't that us?
Yep.
A lot of cases.
Yep.
A lot of cases. God is different than we think.
And now, if somebody comes to you and says, sacrifice your son, now you know it's not God. Abraham wouldn't have known that. He couldn't have told the difference between the false gods and the real gods on that point because he hadn't been taught. But now we know that that would be a false god because we have the law. Well, we have Abraham, we have the law, we have the whole tradition of the prophets, and we have Jesus. So we know that God would never ask that. But Abraham didn't know that. Part of the reasons God did ask him that was to expose how illegitimate that would be. So you and I now, we can discern that easily, but we will have other blind spots.
Right.
So, but praise God for Abraham. God got to expose that little falsehood in him, so he had to suffer for it. But we have never had to face that test since then. But we still do have to surrender our children. But praise God, he would never ask us to sacrifice them.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, we'll see you all next time. Keep reading.
Keep reading. Keep it up. You're doing a good job.